after the meeting. We want to talk this morning about how we've seen local authorities develop, particularly since the 2011 Localism Act. We're going to talk about their benefits and their pitfalls. Many are successful and contribute to the overall finances of the councils through surpluses and profits. Others create local employment. Some have addressed a market failure and where things have come back into local authorities, and others deliver real value, real social value. But there have also been failures, and today we're going to talk about both. So we're going to use the work that we've been doing with councils, particularly with Nottingham and other places, to talk about what we've seen and what we've found. We've put together a high-level panel for this. So we have on our panel Clive Heaphy, who's former Section 151 of Birmingham. He's a current acting director of resources at Nottingham, and he's the improvement panel member for commercial at Peterborough, all of which have got companies. Rob Whiteman, who many of you will also know, is the chief executive of CIPFA. He's a former local authority chief executive and treasurer, as well as being a former senior civil servant. Our panel's made up then by Joanne Pitt, who's head of policy at CIPFA and author of CIPFA's guidance on companies. So we're going to make this as interactive as we can. It's not going to be death by PowerPoint, you'll be pleased to know. So we're going to ask you to put questions. We will take some questions after each of the panelists. And then at the end, after about half an hour, we'd like to have more of a debate between the panelists based on the questions. So if you could put the questions into the Q&A box, please, that would be really helpful. In terms of going forward, I'd like to hand to Rob now to start the panel discussion. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks very much, John. Good afternoon, everyone. I've got a bit of a frog in my throat. I've obviously drunk too much coffee this morning, so forgive me. Most management problems come down to two things, don't they? Strategy and execution, and these are separate domains, and we have to get both right. Very often at the moment with company structures where we talk about some of the failures, I think it's probably more often poor execution rather than poor strategy, but it's important to have both in mind. On strategy, the obvious thing to say is, are we setting up the company for the right reason, and how does it fit into the strategy that we want to see for the community we serve? Setting up a company is a good way of managing risk or trading or ensuring some form of focus or skills, but it's important to set up the company for the right reason. In other words, it's meeting a strategic aim in what you want to do. If companies are set up for the wrong reason, and sometimes in rare cases, we see there is an attraction to a lack of transparency by putting something in a company structure. Perhaps it won't be open to scrutiny as rigorously, or in a very few cases, sometimes this can be a mechanism to pay people a bit more outside of the JNC pay structure. These are the wrong reasons, and companies should not be set up for that purpose. They're set up because they help you to deliver the organization's strategic intent, as just said. So then we come on to execution, and I guess generally on execution, it generally comes down to, have you got the right people, and have we got the right governance and decision-making processes in place for those people to flourish? And that there's a whole load of issues that we can unpick there, because if you think about companies, you know, what's the benefit of something being in a company compared to being a public body? Public bodies are juggling 100 things at a time. We're fantastic at being able to meet multiple needs and ends and having to juggle a lot of things, companies tend to focus on one thing, and they can bring a certain focus and bearing to a particular problem or service. In a commercial setting, people are often remunerated more. Many companies flourish by people having skin in the game through share ownership schemes. People have a real stake in that. That's quite hard to square with managing public money and acting in the public interest, where generally remuneration is viewed as being tighter or more closely managed than what people may earn in the commercial sector. So there's no right answer to this. I think the point that I'm making is, if you are going to get the very best people and you're going to use a company structure to do that, you need to think about how that will look for the owner of the company, for you as a public body, because ultimately you will be setting up this company structure probably in order that the company can do things and get people and develop skills and talent and perhaps incentivize people in a way that you can't as a public body. Setting up a company in itself doesn't suddenly make you commercial. And in a way, if you're not going to do some of those things I've just said about incentivizing people and perhaps paying a bit more and getting the type of talent to compete with the market in the private sector on those skills and disciplines, then go back to square one and think about, is this a good idea? Are we doing it for the right reasons? My final set of comments, and then I'll hand back to John, are really about governance. The joy of working in the public sector is that we work with politicians who are driven by passion and driven by a mandate and driven by things that they want to do. And in a local authority setting, we square that with officers being analytically driven and evidence driven and driven by experience and professionalism. And the balance between the two leads to the best result. I think some of the poor execution that we've seen on companies is because of poor governance, that where in a commercial setting, you would really kick the can down the road in terms of taking a long time to make an investment decision, welcoming ideas that it might be the wrong thing to do, stress testing whether this is going to work. Sometimes, because we operate in a political setting, we just want to get things over the line quickly, make decisions quickly, not be seen to drag our feet on them. And I think in the rare cases of failure that we've seen, I think governance is viewed as an overhead or a bureaucracy and perhaps not acting in a commercial way. Whereas in truth, in the commercial sector, the opposite is true. Governance is seen as being very commercial, and having doubt and skepticism that we may be doing the right thing and testing it again and looking for evidence and looking for market analysis is in fact being very commercial. And so again, no right and wrong answers on this, but I think the more that you have independent governance in a commercial setting, and although people mean well, there can be conflicts of interest. If you're a statutory officer of an authority that has set up a company structure, you have a fiduciary duty to that company. You're a chief officer of the local authority, but also you've helped to set up this structure. And so are you going to call it to account if it's not performing as well as you thought it might? And so actually, I think there are conflicts here that are worth thinking through. And on the whole, companies will flourish if they have independent, experienced challenge built into their governance in order to make sure they're doing the right thing. And my final comment is, remember, I think most of all, this affects your own reputation and the reputation of your own authority. But, sorry, that's that frog in my throat. But there is a reputational risk for the sector as well. If there were too many failures and things go wrong, we will start to see more intervention from government, and that could affect the whole sector and not just the few that get it wrong. I think, for example, on prudential borrowing, regulations have always allowed the government to prescribe that some authorities may lose the right to prudential borrowing, but it's never been used. And now we're seeing in PWLB consultation that those provisions are being strengthened. Do I think that some authorities will lose the right to borrow prudentially? I do. And obviously you don't want to be one of those, but more importantly, it could affect the whole sector's ability if there's too much failure. So really grateful to hear from Clive in a sec about a real example, and Joanne to talk about CIPFA's guidance on this. But most of all, you want to get it right for your own organisation. But remember, there is a sector-wide perspective on this as well. In some recent announcements, we're seeing that the government is getting very interventionist in nature. We could have a whole seminar on how should that intervention take place. My view has always been that the sector benefited by an independent body sitting between the minister's best value powers and then the bodies themselves. We haven't had that independent body sitting between us and ministers' powers since the abolition of the Audit Commission. Therefore, you are going to see ministers being more interventionist and operating in that space and doing some things that the sector isn't comfortable about. John, back to you.
Thanks, Rob. And please, if you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. But just before we hand over to Clive, Rob, there's been major changes since 2011 with companies. You talked about the consequences for the sector if they get it wrong. Do you see commercial arrangements are here to stay in many ways. Do you see a growth of companies going forward, or do you see people being more cautious?
I think we probably will see a growth in companies. If you sit back for a second, whilst the next year sees some resources come through the comprehensive spending review, and we've just seen that in the settlement this week, from 23-24 onwards, resources are going to get very tight and people are going to look for innovative solutions. So we are likely to see the growth in companies. What I want to see is strong companies operating properly because they're done for the right reason, they fit into a strategy and they're well executed. If we get a plethora of companies that don't fit that bill, actually the ability of the sector to set up companies and operate commercially may not only be curtailed for those few authorities, but you could start to see restrictions on the sector.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much. I'm sure there'll be more questions, Rob, at the end. Can I hand over to Clive now, please? And Clive, the floor's yours.
Thank you very much, John, and good afternoon, colleagues, and good to be speaking to you today. If I might start really just reflecting on Nottingham and where Nottingham is really as a bit of a case study, then I'll reflect a little bit about what good governance looks like and perhaps some of the lessons learned as well. A Nottingham organisation, turnover 240 million, population 330,000, set up around 8 companies over a number of years. And the primary purpose for those companies was to provide dividends back in to the council, which is a laudable aim in its own right, but actually wasn't backed by a strategy, wasn't necessarily backed by service aims and ideals. It was really about having the dividends. And clearly when things go wrong and you've started to rely on those dividends for core income, then that becomes a real problem. And in Nottingham's case, the demise of Robin Hood Energy, as Rob touched on, was clearly a very painful thing for Nottingham, having to write off £38 million worth of loans and equity in the process. And a learning point there coming out of the public interest report that was issued by the auditors Grant Thornton, around the lack of good governance, the lack of financial control, the lack of visibility of the metrics of the company. None of the council wasn't cited on any of those, and arguably that combined with filling it with directors who are councillors who knew nothing about a volatile energy company with part of the causes of the problem. You combine that with what they call institutional blindness in that report as well, i.e. the desire to keep pumping money in because you believe you can turn it around, the sort of Nick Leeson syndrome from Rogue Trader. Those are the kind of behaviours that we saw there, and ultimately led to the demise of Robinhood Energy. But we've all, for those of us who've got companies, we've all probably seen that where they are dependent on the public for services or selling services into public areas, and I can think in Nottingham, the National Ice Centre, the Torval and Dean Centre, and a couple of others, and the bus company is another one, where actually patronage has fallen away post Brexit, and therefore the business models are having to be completely rewritten again to take account of something that's a bit different. So there's a lot of issues that are going to arise, and we work in a fairly troubled world here in terms of managing the benefits that you want from a company, but taking the downside risk that can go with it. And of course, with a company, you lose direct control. You have a degree of arm's length influence over it, but that company is set up to be operationally independent, and you've only got so many levers that you can pull. So there's a good side and a bad side that goes with it. Just reflecting on where we're trying to move to now in terms of best practice, we first of all, and I did this at Birmingham as well, we set up a company governance committee. So we set aside a bunch of members whose role is to look at the companies in a dedicated way and to receive annual business plans for approval, receive at least an annual presentation from the company on the key risks, their key financials, some of it taken in public, some of it taken in exempt session. But getting the members really involved in that has been quite critical. And that's about doing the boring stuff really well. There is no substitute for the basics. So we're following now the local government, the lawyers in local government code of governance, which is the right thing to do. That sets out the way you should be doing it. And, we've taken a good look at it and think there's nothing wrong in there with anything. We'll follow that pretty closely, but also in a way that makes sure we achieve the outcomes from our companies that we want, whilst giving those companies, as I say, the operational freedom to run, which they really need. We've also looking alongside setting up that, we're setting up a shareholder unit, a dedicated unit of people responsible for the commercial activities. So it's a small unit, but that will give advice to the companies. It will provide the bridge between the companies and the member committee that enables us to make sure that we can manage closely what's going on in the companies. A part of that will be having a finance person on that team who will be responsible for collating monthly information from the companies, monthly performance information. So as I put it to my colleagues quite frequently, so the minute the company blinks, I know about it, and we can start to say, what does that mean? Do we need to intervene in some way? Do we need to help and put some further support in, or do we need to move to something more radical at that point in time? But we've got the information and the intelligence to know about it. We've also formalised the role of the shareholder representative. Actually, it's a great opportunity to develop people in the organisation who want to gain those commercial skills, to train them as an adjunct to their jobs, to train them in the role of being commercial and what a commercial rep means on the companies, and then to roll that out. So it is a development opportunity for internal staff, and they can be company agnostic. It doesn't really matter. They know how to be a good shareholder rep and what to look out for in terms of representing the shareholders' interests. But also alongside that, we've developed board effectiveness reviews and pushing those out through the companies, make sure we've got a common approach to risk registers, etc., and also advising members on conflicts of interest and the role of members. And of course, members will sometimes forget that when they are sitting on a company, they are there to represent the interests of the company, not the interests of the council. And that duality of role has been quite problematic at Nottingham, where we've had to pull a few members back from some of those roles and create some pretty inviolate rules that we're working, transitioning towards. We're not there yet, i.e. that, for instance, if you are an executive board member, cabinet member, you cannot be a chair of a company, certainly, and probably shouldn't be on the board at all. So trying to make sure we've got adequate separation of those roles in line with the lawyers in local government principle. So there are a few of the things that we're doing in order to make sure that we can deliver. A few learning points so far. Companies do put you into a different world. It's not your world. It's a very different skill set. Robinhood Energy was a great learning point in that, best will in the world, you've got some people trying to run it who didn't know anything about a very volatile sector, and have the right people in there, but ultimately you lose that degree of control, and ultimately the outcomes are not, you can only influence to a degree, but you can't push them so to the limit. It is a company, it's not you may own it, but there's only so much influence you can have over it in order to give operational freedom. So you can manage that through the right articles, the right kind of shareholder agreements and working protocols that are really critical underneath this. And it's important that we get those right. And it's also important that we manage the relationships day to day, particularly with the chairs of those boards and with the managing directors of those companies. Directorships are often misunderstood for the reasons I've given. We've pushed the members through IOD training as well, which proved very valuable in terms of learning that role, but get members into that right space is a learning point that's critical. Board effectiveness reviews you'd see in any well-governed company, and again, we've had some pushback from some of our companies, but we are insisting that they do board effectiveness reviews at their cost, not ours, by the way. But it's important for them that they make sure they've got the necessary skills, and they take time to self-evaluate and work through that model. We also insist, by the way, that we have a right of veto over any changes to senior management or to the board, so we get to look at that. If you do need specialists people to engage within those companies, for a number of our companies, we've had to have some specialists in there, and that costs money in that sector. When in Robin Hood Energy's case, we're talking about bringing in energy professionals, those people do not come cheap. So, but ultimately the cost of failure is a higher one. So I think it's really important that we reflect that at the outset. And perhaps just one final thought, that make sure that you've got agility in your decision-making processes. When a company gets into distress, that can happen quickly. We monitor very carefully now through the sort of quantitative analysis we do, the cash flows of all of those companies, and we've worked with the companies to make those cash flows really robust and really strong. And on the basis of that, we can see pretty quickly where there are risk areas around risk of insolvency. So for instance, a bus grant being withdrawn now from the bus company, that presents a cash flow issue alongside a high student population where there's no season tickets being sold. So the cash flow now becomes the problem. So have that visibility over the cash flow, but have your governance in a way that if you need to act in an agile way to step in quickly, you can do it and don't go through protracted discussions around a committee structure. Just be agile. So I will hand back to John at that point, and happy to answer any questions you might have in the future.
Thanks, Clive. One of the questions that we've got come in is, do you think officers involved in local authority companies should ideally be non-exec directors rather than executives?
Yeah, I do. I think I don't think executive director is it depends on the role, I guess, you have in the authority, but I don't think it puts you in a duality of role there, which is quite different, and I don't like seeing that personally. I think the non-executive role is a far better one if you're going to do it. It really does separate that advisory role for a company from your day-to-day job. When you are an executive director making decisions there, that can often conflict with the work you're doing. So very, very definitely, I'd prefer that model in general terms, although there's never such a thing as one size fits all.
And Clive, I mean, you've been involved in companies in different places. In terms of members, do you think members are getting more au fait with what their role should be on companies, or do you still think that's more of a grey area? Because certainly from our work, it was a grey area in the past.
Still a grey area.
Members thought.
Yeah, still a grey area. Although failure can concentrate the minds of members quite a lot, and colleagues will be aware that I was forced to issue a Section 114 notice prior to Christmas for unlawful spending on the Almo, on the council's company, the Almo. And that's forced the council directors sitting on the Almo to question their role, who was advising them at the time, etc. So I think we're seeing here a slight shift to recognition that when it goes wrong and you're a councillor and the director, actually it can go wrong big time and you can feel very, very exposed. So I think the dynamics here are turning, but it's been failure that's driven that rather than rationale and good arguments.
Okay, and just take another question that's just come in. One authority is looking at a steering group to generate lost income for the council rather than a company. Any views on that? So totally opposite to the company?
I think look at all the different models that are available. A company isn't necessarily the right thing to do, and there's a range of different models. You know, we've got some models here that look at trustees. There's other models that look in different ways. So I would say don't be wedded to a company in that limited status. Think about what the aims and objectives are, or what you're trying to do, and get the right model for it, and take the right advice.
Yeah, and I think picking up on what Rob said earlier and what you're reinforcing now, Clive, some of the work that about companies should be set up for the right strategic reasons. I know we've done a fair bit of work with different management teams who are looking at commercialism, and the first word is, do we need a company? And I think, you know, we go back to basics and say, no, look what you're trying to achieve, and then if it's the company's the right way, then that's the right way, but don't do it just for the sake of doing it.
I think that's right. And just say on the Nottingham City Homes example, I mean, that was set up with a good political aim in mind. The aim of alleviating fuel poverty is a very worthy political aim, but did it really support a service? I'm not sure it did at the end of the day. And there's a danger in just allowing the politics to dominate over the rational business decision-making process.
Okay, thanks, Clive. If we can hand over to Jo now, please, in terms of the work that we've been doing and that she's been doing in terms of the advice and guidance that will be coming out. Jo, over to you.
Thanks, John. Yes, it's been good as I've listened to all the other speakers about the comments they've been making. It's reassured to see how much of that is in the new publication. So as I say, there's a new publication coming out from CIPFA fairly shortly on council-owned companies, and I use that in its broadest term because obviously there are a number of different types of company that you can have. This piece of work has been sort of started in the summer, and it looks and complements the work that we've done on the Financial Management Code, which was introduced in 2019. So it sort of almost deep dives into one of the areas that we knew when we talked about the Financial Management Code that we wouldn't be looking at. And the structure of the publication sits under 4 main headings, and both Rob and Clive and yourself, John, have mentioned a lot of the work that complements those particular headings. So we look at setup. So starting as well, right at the beginning, what are the different types of companies? And that very important question about, you know, whether you even need that company to be set up in the first place, and the reasons behind that setup. So we spend quite a lot of time looking at those decision making and making sure that's very transparent and a clear understanding across the organisation as to where that company fits in the strategy and direction of the local authority. We then move on to governance, and governance is dominant throughout the publication because it's so key. And when it fails, often the organisation suffers, and the new company and the company setup is a problem. And we include in that roles and responsibilities. So that includes the discussion on directors and the different legislation, so you know, operating under Companies Act rather than under local authorities, and they're very, very different. And it's really important that board members are aware of those changes. And then we talk about the role of governance and the role of the board, and you know, going back to some sort of fairly basic ideas around the importance of the paperwork and around the communication between the new company and the local authority. So we cover all that in detail. We then look at some more operational issues about new companies, sort of things like, you know, staffing and what's going to happen with staffing, and the conversations with trade unions. We look at assets and sort of where the organisation is going to be set up and how that's going to work. Looking at cash flow and the importance of all that being in place so that when that organisation runs and continues over the years, that is monitored and evaluated. And then the final chapter in the publication is all about assurance, and that's looking at the monitoring, the reporting, and how that works both internally in the organisation, but also how that links back to ensure that there's strategic oversight from the company, from the local authority. We very much support Clive's comment about making sure that there's a review process, and we also include in the publication a sort of structure about reviewing the setup of council-owned companies and making sure that the organisation knows the exposure of risks within that setup, because quite often local authorities have more than one company and they'll range very differently on what they do and how they operate. But it's important that there's an overall oversight of the total risk within those structures. We've worked with a lot of stakeholders, so we've had conversations across the piece about the work that we're doing. So we really appreciate those that have fed back. And we've also worked very closely with John and his team, who've worked in organisations with regards to councils. So we recognise quite clearly that the challenges are seen, and we've seen public interest reports very recently, we've seen reviews, and we've seen some very high profile failures. But it is important that we have also got successes, and you know, sometimes they're not shouted about as much, but it's important that we do recognise that there are successes, because you know, owning companies is not something new. It's been going on for years. It has increased since sort of 2010, and we see a rise in that. But it has been something that has been a local authority activity for many, many, many years. So we recognise those challenges and the risks that are presented, which are both reputational as well as financial. There's a huge reputational risk when a local authority company fails. So what did we set out to try and achieve by the publication? A publication is a good practice guide. So it sits in the stable of other good practice guides that CIPFA has. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to see if we could use it to drive up improvement in standards across the board in this particular area. We've seen that there was a need for that. And we've looked right from the start, so right from setup all through to reviewing. So we've put it all in one particular publication. We also wanted to make sure that people were learning lessons from other organisations. So, you know, we've worked with Nottingham to put into the publication good practice and lessons learned. And, you know, we've referred back to the practice, the public insight reports, and we will continue to do that. And I suppose the other thing is we have tried to shine a light on the challenges and the risks that are associated with council-owned companies, so that people go in with their eyes fully wide open. So that increase in transparency and that increase in risk awareness will hopefully mean that there's a reduction and an improvement in the management of that risk. You can never take out risk completely. We wouldn't possibly think that that was going to be the case, but knowing about the risk as you go in is something that hopefully will help the sector. We've been particularly keen to sort of put in things about exit strategies right at the very beginning, because we've identified that as a particular challenge where councils perhaps have not been realistic in understanding that there needs to be an exit strategy if something goes wrong. We've tried to make it accessible. So in each of the chapters, you'll see a series of questions that start debate and discussion and can be used across the board to generate a conversation about the council-owned companies. And we certainly hope that it's going to be a really useful tool to the sector as it goes forward. It is a starting place for the conversation. You can see from the work of John and Clive that it's a huge discussion point, and we hope that that will be a starting place rather than a finishing point for additional work that we're going to do over the next year.
Oops. Thanks very much, Jo. And Jo, do you just want to remind us the formal title of the guidance and when it's been published? Joe, we can't hear you.
Sorry, guidance will be the CIPFA guidance on council-owned companies, and it should be available shortly. We're hoping it will be out in March.
Okay, thank you. Rob, Clive, if you can join us back now, that'd be really helpful. We've got lots of questions. We've got a couple of themes going here. One of the themes that seems to be is about the, I was going to say expertise, about local authority officers going on to running the companies, and whether they understand the companies well enough, whether we should be buying in, or the sector should be buying in skills from outside to run what are commercial undertakings. Any views on that?
I'll happily start, John. I think that it's always been the case that local authority statutory officers, particularly the 151, can often represent the council in other bodies. And very often the 151 officer may be an accountable officer for some other public entity. If you've outsourced to a big company, sometimes JV structures are set up, and you want your 151 officer on the board of that JV, and that's always been the case. However, there's a but coming. I do think that where local authorities are setting up company structures themselves to trade, this isn't about being a representative on another bigger company that's providing services to you, or representing the council in some accountable body sense. I think where we're in this, commercial environment of setting up companies, actually you want to buy in expertise where you can. There is a real expertise in public financial management from a client or a commissioner perspective. We have, really very, very talented and Section 151 officers understanding, how to make difficult decisions and advise that through political governance, and to advise on complex transactions around pension funds and treasury management and all sorts of other things. However, that is not commercial experience of being in a company operating to a different set of commercial skills, with experience of business development and marketing and pipeline and all sorts of other commercial skills that are a different skill set to being a really strong public finance professional. And on the whole, John, I think in the old days I could understand why 151 officers were representing the council on things like JVs and as accountable officers. But where we're now seeing a plethora of companies being set up, on the whole, I think we should buy in commercial expertise, because it's a different skill set.
And Clive, I don't know whether you want to comment, because you've got an array of, or been involved over the years with an array of companies from the electricity generating to indoor arenas. How do you see that working out in the future?
I'd agree with Rob. I think increasingly the companies are relatively complex as well, and they need some skills in there. I mean, for Nottingham, for instance, I can put the juxtaposition, something like a Robin Hood Energy, or we have a thing called Enviro Energy, which is a district heating scheme as well. They require some pretty specialist knowledge, and I can't claim to have knowledge or enough skill set around the energy industry. But where we have Nottingham Revs and Bens, for instance, which is an extension of an in-house company set up rightly or wrongly to generate some external business. That's much more core business, where a finance person, myself included, could happily sit on this. But I agree with Rob. One of the jobs I had along my career was setting up a global offshoot of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, a company called FCO Services, set up on a completely commercial trading basis. And you have to learn the language of business development, of marketing, of pipeline management, management. It's a skill set and a language you don't necessarily know. And if you and also the focus on companies is very much more on cash flows than you're traditionally seeing in local authority. And you've got to be able to understand cash flow management and the importance of that. So I think unless you're taking the time to skill yourself up for those particular things, then you're always going to be behind the curve in terms of your role on that company. And I agree with Rob there, for that buying in people is probably better on balance in most cases.
Okay, question to all three of you really, and it's again a theme that's coming through, is the role of the audit committee and also the role of internal audit when it comes to companies. How do you see that sitting, or should sit?
I'm happy to go first. I'm going to say something slightly controversial, so forgive me, everyone. You all know I love the sector dearly. As somebody who sits across seeing audit committees operate in central government, in agencies, in the NHS, in local government, in charities, on the whole, audit committees in local government are weak compared to other parts of the public sector. And that's surprising, bearing in mind that financial management, I think, is stronger in local government than many other parts of the public sector. And local government manages to balance the books in a way that many public bodies don't. But of course, outside of local government, there is a clear line of sight from an audit committee. You have an audit committee made up with experienced finance professionals who are independent, and they have a line of sight through to the board, usually because the chair of the audit committee is then the audit non-exec director who sits on the main board. So if any of you are in an NHS trust, for example, they're on the NHS Trust Board managing the trust alongside the Chief Exec, and the chair will be an audit NED who is a member of the board as a non-exec but chairs the audit committee and gives a clear line of sight of the risks that are happening to support the CFO at board level. We just don't have that in local government. We have weak audit committees that don't necessarily have enough independence or enough expertise on them. And the work of the audit committee isn't reported through to the executive or the board in the same way. Now, I think we're going to have to do a lot of work on improving the quality of audit committees, because in a company structure, before you make an investment and commit resources, you're going to have an audit committee all over it with experience of these types of transactions. You're going to have an investment committee all over it. The audit committee and the investment committee are going to have commercial expertise and ask about, are you sure of the market? Are you sure of your pipeline? Are you sure you've got the tools to be able to deliver this? So I think we've got to strengthen audit committees. And of course, in the response to the Redmond review, the government has said it will work with CIPFA to strengthen audit committees. And I don't mean that to be pejorative, John and colleagues, about the sterling work that councillors have tried to do on audit committees over the years. But if you've got councillors on audit committees, as we do, it makes them more like a sort of public accounts committee, a scrutiny committee, than actually being the type of audit committee that you see in other parts of the public sector, or indeed in the corporate sector. For internal audit, internal audit is a management function, even if it's outsourced. It is part of the executive, and it's part of management to get under the bonnet of things. On the whole, because of cuts, as with finance departments, getting internal audit to have those skills to be able to get under the bonnet and to advise on assurance, I think you're very often going to need to put some more resources into internal audit to help them buy in expertise if you don't have people within internal audit who can do that. But internal audit, in a commercial setting, plays a very important part in getting under the bonnet of these things, particularly on execution.
Okay.
I'd also add, John, there that, again, agree with much of what Rob said there, that the role of an audit committee is ultimately to make sure that the controls are in place across the organisation. There's a framework of internal controls which is effective, and that goes to how we control our companies. and that audit committee should have oversight and get themselves assurance on that those controls are in place and working effectively. Similarly with risk, their role is to set a risk management framework. Their role is not to manage the risks. So with that in mind, I'm quite comfortable with the role that audit play, but I take Rob's point that ultimately they're not necessarily skilled with the right skills. And certainly here at Nottingham, we don't have an independent chair, and I do think it's an essential prerequisite that we move towards an independent chair model of audit committees. We set up the company governance committee to manage those risks, to talk to the companies themselves, to manage the operations, and effectively form a specialist scrutiny function. So it performs that role of scrutiny, but they've had specialist training in what their role is in regard to companies. So they can talk to the companies, they can understand company accounts because they've been trained to do that in the right way. So that's how we've tried to get that segregation between audit and the companies committee. The issue about external audit is a very live one at the moment. Obviously, with the Section 114 and 7 years of unlawful expenditure, I'm asking the question about where were our auditors, and they can't hide behind materiality. They're looking at group accounts, and clearly they need to be assuring themselves that everything's in place so there's a true and fair view presented. So I think it's a very live question for me, which I can't yet give you an answer for. And in relation to internal audit, again, I'm looking for the head of audit opinion to give me the assurance that sufficient controls are in place. And if you are placing reliance on the internal audits of the companies, how can you place that reliance? What gives you the assurance that that work is being done to the right standard, etc.? So I'm not looking to do the work of the companies through the internal auditor, but I am looking to get assurance on an AGS group accounts basis that everything is in order in terms of the way these things are managed.
Okay,
can I just put a button there as well, John? For the publication, when we talked about this, what it did become evident, having spoken to a lot of the stakeholders and doing our research, was that sometimes this was one of the areas that wasn't covered in detail right at the very beginning. And so you talk about the importance of, I noticed in the questions about business planning and setup. And there's a lot of those sorts of questions, those operational questions that, are, oh, we'll sort it at the back. Well, it doesn't matter. We'll do that at the end. And actually, these are really key questions that need to be addressed right at the beginning so that you've got that assurance in place and it doesn't become something that's an add-on, because what happens then, there's a cost implication. You've got a smaller company, they've got a tighter budget, that becomes an issue. And then we see that squeezed out. When you're doing it, it sort of really comes back to that idea of setup and business and planning. You need to put everything that you want to think about on that piece of paper, even if it's, you're not sure how much it's going to cost you, because if you don't get it down before you start these organizations and start the company setup, the cost starts to escalate. And when you've got the small companies where they're looking at, for a balance and having to report back to the local authority, they become very concerned if they've got costs that weren't originally identified, and then we see risks arising. And this is a classic. Make sure you've got enough money for the audit, and that's included right at the very beginning.
And Joe, thank you. And I think if you some of the questions that are coming in, there is a theme about business cases, and what we would say very much is, we've not always found that there's a business case when we've looked at the setup of a company, but I can't emphasize enough, those business cases, they need to be there and they need to be robust. Otherwise, how are you going to judge when you're going to be successful? And I don't know whether Clive or Rob want to comment, but in terms of a business case, there's no point taking an optimistic view. You need to take a realistic view of where you think you're going to be, because otherwise you're just fooling what yourselves in terms of and storing up problems for later down the line.
Well, I agree with that, John. If you think about the way that we think, the way that we're wired, if we're going to invest in a housing scheme or build a new leisure centre or give social services a new computer system, we're sort of wired, aren't we, to think about, we understand the service, we've got expertise in that area, we know there's public purpose to it, elected members give us insight on what's needed and what the policy needs are, and there's a mandate, and public bodies make good public administration decisions. That's a different set of wiring to making commercial decisions on a business case for something that we don't necessarily have expertise in. And in a commercial setting, you have to go to the banks and ask for money, and they're going to be all over your business case and say, well, we're not going to give you money unless you tell us what the business case is. You go through your own investment committee, an audit committee full of people with commercial experience who say, is this the right thing to do? Have you got the evidence that the business case will materialize? And finally, you will think about investing and executing that properly, as we said earlier, with the advice of internal audit and other mechanisms. So these are different worlds, aren't they, John? And the reason that we invest in public services and the way that we're wired and the DNA of our profession to be able to deal with that is a different intellectual and professional challenge to making a business case for a commercial venture with all the rigor. We don't have to go to the banks. We don't have to go to an investment committee. We don't have to. Actually, we can sign it off and say, yeah, we're investing in that in quite a quick way. And so I think, John, the fact that you often do see that business cases are almost developed after the event or strengthened after the event in order to show why we made the decisions we made isn't the right way round, is it? No. And the initial business case and the challenge that goes with it for an investment grade decision, would a bank put money in this based on the business case that we're providing? It's a different challenge.
Yeah, you have to think like a credit committee as well. So you've got to think like a credit committee. And I know to my cost at the moment, because I'm making lots of provisions in Nottingham for all the company loans that could potentially go bad now. And that's those, when you're doing the business case at the outset, you think about your exit strategy too. You think about the options you've got. You think also about, how am I going to govern this entity? How am I going to put financial controls around it? You ask yourself, what's the model for running that at the same time? So all of these really critical, but get yourself into the mindset of a bank credit committee, because that will give you the kind of thinking that you want.
John, I was just going to say, I think a point on that is don't underestimate the importance of challenge on that business case. Sometimes things are politically very attractive, because there's a social element there, and I'm not saying that is wrong in any way, but you can't allow the sort of social attractive element of that to dominate the money side. I mean, that, and sometimes we see that, and so business challenge has to be really, really strong, and and really question everything. It can't be coloured by the idea of sort of something that's socially very attractive. Which that will obviously go into the decision making, but there has to be a really strong business case challenge for the money side of it as well.
And just from my own personal experience, I started out in the public sector, went to the private sector, went to some FTSE companies, and then came back. The level of challenge when you're trying to get an investment in a FTSE 100 company and to set something up, and the level of detail that you have to go to is way beyond anything I've ever seen in a local authority. I just couldn't believe it. It was like being interrogated on a business case. It was very, very hard. And just I'm conscious of the time. A question that's come in, which links with another question for Clive, really, but I think for all the panel is, does the panel wish to share its reflections on what the economic impact of COVID-19 has taught us about the risks associated with public sector ownership of companies, especially in the transport sector, e.g. aviation, bus, tram, etc.? Clive, you've got, as we know, you've got a tram company. You've also got an indoor arena that does events and an ice arena, all of which stopped, which wasn't expected, let's be honest, when the year before, but as a result of COVID. Any reflections on that? Because that's a risk that does happen.
Awesome. Funny enough, I was looking through the chat and I alighted on that question in the chat. It's sitting there now. So that very question. And yeah, I mean, COVID has impacted quite substantially, but we need to think about these things up front. Back to the original business case, they have to be stress tested under various scenarios. To some extent, you'll say that COVID has been exceptional, even beyond normal stress testing, but we need to have thought these out before as to how we might handle them. And there's a lesson there for all of us, I think, in terms of not necessarily doing that. With yeah, you're right, the Nottingham tram system, the Nottingham bus company and the National Eye Centre are three areas where we've seen significant fall off in patronage. I mean, down to the Eye Centre was down to 10% of normal patronage, and the bus company at one stage down to 25%. So bounced back now to 60. But nonetheless, that means some tough decisions ahead as bus grant starts to go about. In the case of the Eye Centre, do we still think it's right that the council owns it? Is that operating at too slim a margin? And bear in mind, any leisure attractions like that are often their working capital is provided by promoters paying the money up front, and that's a very risky model when promoters can pull out at any point in time and can leave the authority very exposed. So are we actually best placed to run a facility like that, or do we do as a Birmingham did with the Genting Arena or Manchester with an AY Arena and put it into private operator hands because they can best manage the risks in a different way? And that's an honest question the politicians don't like, but we're having to ask the question. In the case of the bus company, it's very much a case of if those numbers aren't going to bounce back, we're going to have to take some tough decisions on sort of future salary expectations, on the number of bus routes that you're running, and do you need to cut back on those? How do you cut back on your overheads? Can we work together in terms of sharing overheads? So we're working very much with the companies to try and understand what a future model might look like, but we have to be prepared for the fact that that business model going forward might be a very different one from the one we had in the past if those COVID effects continue on that particular company.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm very conscious of the time. We've covered a lot of ground. There's still a load of questions in the chat. I've tried to pick some of the themes out. I guess from my perspective, what I'd like to say is I'd like to thank the panelists today. I think they've given us a great insight. There are two things also to point out. One is the publication that's coming out that Joe refers to, and we will make sure that everyone who's signed up to this gets a prior notice of when it's coming out. And the second is in terms of the network that CIPFA is creating as well, or recreating around this, which again we will make sure everyone gets details of. But I think, in terms of this afternoon, I think it's been really good. Thank you very much indeed for your attendance, and we look forward to seeing more of you in the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well done, John. You finished early. That's always a sign of a good seminar. Very good.
2 minutes back.
Yeah, no, very good. Well done. Take care, everyone.
Cheers then. Bye.